World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. However, a Second World War soon followed just a couple decades later. During the Second World War, the Navajo Nation code talkers played a big part in creating a code based on their native language that would help conclude the war. This code was created and the enemy could not decipher it. The Navajo are the most well-known of the code talkers during the World Wars. However, they were not the first. The Choctaw Nation was forced to move to Indian Territory in the early 1830s. On May 28, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed into effect the Indian Removal Act. This law would provide for an exchange of lands with the Indians residing in any of the states or territories and for their removal west of the river Mississippi. The Choctaws, then residing in Mississippi, signed the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, assuring them land in the new territory they called Oklahoma, or Red People in Choctaw. The Choctaws were the first of the 5 civilized tribes to move west. The Choctaw people began the forced migration in the winter of 1830. This journey covered over 2,000 miles. Over 4,000 natives died during the horrific trip called the Trail of Tears to a new land that they were forced to call home. Even after having to move from their homeland, when the Choctaws finally got settled, many of the Choctaw children were placed in boarding schools. The purpose of these schools was to sophisticate the children. Many got in trouble at school for speaking their native language.
That schools themselves thought it was best to literally punish out of them.
This tragedy was the gateway to the finding of the Choctaw language that was later one of the greatest triumphs for the Allied powers to win World War I in forcing the Germans to surrender. The United States' involvement in the war wouldn't come until 1917. At that time, in southeast Oklahoma, 19 Choctaw men volunteered for the U.S. Army. The Choctaw men were recruited into the 36th Division. This division was made up of men from Oklahoma and Texas. They were given brief training at Camp Bowie before they were transported to the Western Front in France in October 1918. While on the Western Front, the Choctaw soldiers and the many other soldiers of the war suffered terrible conditions.
So they endured cold weather. They endured lack of food and water. There was a period of time that's documented that they did not get water, but their commanding officer sent cans of tomato juice to them to drink the juice off the tomatoes instead of water. And they were thirsty, so they were glad to have it.
Communication was mainly by radio or telephone at the time, and the Germans were able to decipher every secret message passed between Allied forces. Also, the cryptographs had to be encoded, transmitted, and then decoded. This took time. The Choctaw language, still forbidden to be spoken in boarding schools, was not just found out by the U.S. government by accident. It was found by chance. Many accounts tell of the story of a U.S. soldier accidentally overhearing 2 Choctaw men having a conversation. While the soldier asked what language they were speaking, they merely said they were speaking their own. With this chance encounter, the groundwork was in place for creating a code that the Allied forces would use to win the war. The Choctaw soldiers were immediately rounded up and commissioned in creating a code. While the Choctaw language was by itself a new code the Germans had never heard before, they created another code to go within that. For example, the military term machine gun was called Little Gun Shoot Fast and then transmitted into the Choctaw language. Many of the military terms were also created in this same way. The plan was put to the test on the night of October 26th. The Choctaws were used to orchestrate the removal of 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion from Chauvelin to Chardonnay. The strategy worked without a hitch. 2 days later, at the Battle of Forest Farm, a battle that fortified the position of the Germans, the Choctaw Code was put into full use. The Germans were caught by surprise and at a loss as to what was going on, wrote Lieutenant Colonel Hawley at the time.
This worked beautifully. The enemy couldn't understand it. The messages were sent back and forth. Our troops were able to move forward, and the tide of war began to change.
According to Colonel A.W. Bloor, the tide of the battle turned within 24 hours, and within 72 hours, the Allies were on full attack. According to a story told to his family, code talker Albert Billy recounted a time during the battle that German officers were captured and a general among them asked one question: what nationality was on the phones that night? Only Americans were on the phones that night was the answer. The new system for relaying messages was quick and effective, but mainly it was unbreakable. The transmission of information was not based on a European language or on a mathematical progression. Therefore, the Germans were unable to understand any of the transmissions. The momentum was now in the Allies' favor, and the war ended within a month. With the war ended, the living returned to their lives back home. For the Choctaw Telephone Warriors, life back in southeast Oklahoma would learn little about their exploits during the Great War. Many of them seldom talked about what they did. They returned heroes, but without a hero's welcome, Representative Ron Kind of Wisconsin would later say during a ceremony honoring all the Native American code talkers. Unfortunately, many of the honors and recognitions for the code talkers came after their deaths. The first time that the Choctaw code talkers were formally acknowledged was at the Choctaw Nation Labor Day Festival in September 1986. Then, Chief Hollis Roberts bestowed upon the families of the code talkers the Choctaw Nation Medal of Valor. 3 years later, the French government would award the Choctaw Nation code talkers the Chevalier de l'Ordre National du Mérite, Knight of the National Order of Merit, at a ceremony in Oklahoma City on November 3, 1989. This honor is one of the highest honors given by the French government in recognition for distinguished military achievements. Finally, with the passage of the Code Talkers Recognition Act of 2008, the Choctaw Code Talkers, along with 32 other tribes, received the Congressional Gold Medals for their bravery and valor in World War I and II on November 20, 2013. The Congressional Gold Medal is the highest honor that can be given to a civilian. At the ceremony, then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid stated,
"And in this nation's hour of greatest need, these same Native American languages prove to have great value indeed."
The United States government turned to a people and a language they had tried to eradicate. The road from tragedy to triumph is one that is well known to the Choctaw people. It started with the Trail of Tears, people forced from their native land to a new home only to flourish in the following century. It continued with men who were punished for speaking their native tongue and volunteered to fight for a country that did not consider them equal, only to rise to the occasion and help not only the United States, but the world triumph over tyranny.